All right, welcome everyone. I'm Don Guttenplan. I'm the editor of The Nation, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Nation conversation about Amazon and what's next for American workers. I'm not going to take very much of your time, partly because I'm conserving my voice post-COVID, but also because there are many more interesting people. I'm only going to say two things. I'm going to introduce our moderators, and I'm going to say that I was particularly delighted when Daniel Jutt came and asked if the nation would be willing to be involved in this event for a bunch of reasons. First of all, I'm still a dues-paying member of the National Union of Journalists. So although at the Nation, I have a management role, my sympathies as a union member go a long way back. In my time, I've paid dues and been a member of 4 different unions. And also, I think the nation should be always open to young activists and organizers. So it was a great delight to be asked to do this, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. With that, I hope that if you like this kind of event, you'll come back for more, and that you'll consider looking at www.thenation.com to see the kind of coverage we give to the labor movement. But with that, I'm going to turn to Daniel Jutt, who's a graduate student at Yale, where he studies American political economy and labor history. In 2020, he worked as a political organizer with Unite Here Local 11, a hospitality workers union in Southern California and Arizona. And both before and after that, he has written for The Nation on environmental and labor questions. And his co-moderator, Sophie Clark, is a student at Yale Law School, where she focuses on labor law and housing policy. And she has worked for the National Labor Relations Board and for Unite Here. So with that, Daniel and Sophie, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Don. Good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast, to everyone on the West Coast, good morning. I'm so glad that we're doing this, and thank you to the Nation for jumping at the opportunity. When I first came to Don to talk about this, it was an event that immediately made sense given Hi, can everyone hear me? I'm back. Okay, sorry, right at the pivotal moment. So I was saying thank you to everyone for being here, and thank you to our wonderful panelists, who I will introduce in just a moment. I'm going to be very brief in my opening remarks so that we can spend most of our time hearing from them, and then hearing them respond to some audience questions, which you can put in the chat anytime during our conversation. So I wanted to just set the backdrop for the event and pose a few opening questions to get us started. This event comes at a very exciting moment and is inspired by an exciting moment of labor militancy in the United States, the likes of which we have not seen for at least a few decades, certainly in my lifetime. And unionized, it comes from both unionized workers who are striking at increased rates, and also, perhaps more significantly, a surge in new organizing in non-union workplaces that has occurred over the past year. The most notable, of course, and most public have been campaigns in Starbucks stores across the United States, and more recently at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. But there have been many others as well. And these new organizing campaigns are succeeding. They're winning against often staggering odds and vicious anti-union campaigns by corporate America. And they're posing a significant turning point in, I think, the history of the American labor movement, which we will get into in just a moment. It's worth also mentioning that New York has been in many ways at the center of this turn, not just with organizing at Amazon in Staten Island, but also last fall when the New York City Taxi Workers Alliance won a really incredible victory on debt relief for its members that I would argue in many ways set the tone for the surge in organizing that we've seen this year. And we're incredibly fortunate to have the founder and director of the Taxi Workers Alliance, Baravi Desai, with us today. At the same time, all of this said, it's important to remember that the surge in organizing is coming at a moment of historic weakness in the American labor movement. In the 1950s, private sector union density was around about 35%. It's now hovering just above 6%. And as a result, unions don't have the political power that they used to. And in many ways, they had kind of ceded into the background in American politics for the past couple of decades. And it's this particular combination, both a moment of sort of, I think, for the past few decades, structural decline in unions and in organizing, coupled with an exciting new surge in worker-led movements that is giving us reason to hope that we might be at a bit of an inflection point in the labor movement. And I think already we can see that this new organizing has had all sorts of impacts beyond the workplaces that are being organized. We've seen important discussions about reconfigurations in American politics, certainly in the Democratic Party, which remains both pro-union, but also tied to many corporate interests, and even to some extent in the Republican Party as well. And it's also generated newfound pressure to expand legal protections for workers at a state and federal level. So we're incredibly fortunate to have a panel of folks who can address all of these consequences and get us maybe a start, at least, of some answers to some of the big questions of our current political moment. Why this resurgence in organizing right now? What does it mean for the future of the labor movement in America? And for our listeners and audience, how can we in the general public contribute to this moment of increased worker power? So to get at these questions, I'm going to very quickly introduce our wonderful panel. Jennifer Klein is the Bradford Durfee Professor of History at Yale. Her work focuses on American labor politics, social policy, and political economy in the 20th century US. And she's the author of For All These Rights, Business, Labor, and the Shaping of America's Public-Private Welfare State, which was published by Princeton University Press. And she writes widely on labor politics, including occasionally for thenation.com, among many other publications. We also have Kate Andreas, who's a professor of law at Columbia Law School. She teaches labor and constitutional law. And earlier in her career, she worked as a union organizer with the Service Employees International Union, or SEIU. She's written extensively, publicly and in legal academia, on the failures of US law to protect workers' rights and also the potential for labor law reform. We are incredibly fortunate to be joined by Baravi Desai, who is the executive director and founding member of the New York City Taxi Workers Alliance that I mentioned a few minutes ago, which is a 21,000 member union of New York City yellow cab, green cab, black car, livery, and app dispatched drivers. In 2021, as I mentioned, the union led a campaign to win an incredibly consequential victory on debt relief for its drivers, which culminated in a 45-day protest and hunger strike outside City Hall. And there's a wonderful article in The Nation that you can read about that as well. And then we will hopefully be joined as well by Jose Maldonado, who is the president of Unite Here Local 100. Jose has had a medical emergency this morning and is attending to that, but hopes to be able to join us a bit later. So if he can, that will be wonderful. For the moment, though, these are our panelists, and I think they're incredibly well equipped to address the kind of historic conditions that we find ourselves in today in the labor movement. And I would like, on that note, to begin with Jennifer, with our resident historian, to ask if you wouldn't mind putting this moment in some historical context. Both the weakness of American labor that we've seen over the past couple of decades, why that has come about, and then also why some of the reasons that as a historian, you see this moment being a moment where there has been new organizing surge up. Jennifer.
All right, thank you. And I think I'm so glad that we're all having this conversation. And I think that that kind of captures the historical moment we're in. First of all, I think it's crucial to put up front that unionism is about democratizing the workplace. It's when you have a workforce collectively build power in order to counter these moments of really heightened and visible despotism in the workplace and repression and extensions of managerial control. Low wages are not quite enough to push people to those moments of political change. But if we look over the last 150 years, the crucial moments of union surge, first of all, always come at a moment of weakness by definition, right? This is what pushes it forward. But I think they're happening in strategic new sectors of the economy, whether that was railroads in the 1870s or auto and steel in the 1930s, or in the public sector and service sector from the 60s through the 80s and 90s, or currently what we see in retail and hospitality. But I think it's when workers are able to actually see the ways in which technology are making their jobs more dangerous, more unhealthy, and rendering them so powerless over the control of their lives. And we should think about the fact that, first of all, management seems to have a very long historical memory. The kinds of tactics that were used in Amazon over the last couple of years to undermine unionism have been in play for over a century. And labor often has a short memory and has to keep relearning. Every tactic that Amazon used, it drew out of an old book. But when unions have been successful, whether, again, it's in the late 19th century, the 1930s, the 1960s and 70s, home care workers in the 80s and 90s, or currently, it's when they are using very creative tactics. They recover the use of militancy, as Daniel was saying, are willing to walk out and are willing to strike. And I'm in just kind of a minute that I want to note that one thing that our current moment of the COVID pandemic really pried open was it pushed forward these conversations that had been really long excised from our political culture about risk, work, and security. What are the conditions under which we will and must work, and who has a say in shaping those? And because those are pried open, that's why we see these people marching forward. And we've seen that under conditions of Taylorism in the 1910s. We saw that in the 1930s with the use of the stretch out to create overwork, fewer workers having to work faster, and the speed up. We saw this in the 1960s and 70s in terms of the conditions that nursing home workers and hospital workers and teachers had to face. And this has been critical in the industries like Amazon, where the speed up, the heavier workload, the application of technology, and the lack of control over bodily injury has, really caused that surge in activism. I think the same thing is true with fast food workers all over the world. They have been comparing the fact that they suffer from the same injuries because of the same technologies that they use. And this has pushed them into activism. So it's the use of the creative tactics, I think. It's the building of power from within and using community resources, which I think we should come back to talking to. But it also takes a changed climate from the state and pushing against the hostile state. And that was one of the things that Amazon was so taken by surprise, is that the NLRB wasn't automatically on their side. They were stunned. Their reaction was, what do you mean you're actually facilitating the ability of the union to organize? You're supposed to be playing by the playbook we wrote. And so I think this is a crucial moment of the possibility to finally change the hostile climate of the state in order to be partners with the mobilization on the ground.
Thank you, Jennifer. That was wonderful. And I think the three factors that you mentioned, building power from within, right, in a moment of crisis for workers, using community resources and having those community resources be available, and a changed atmosphere in the power of the state and the role of the state will be in some ways guiding questions for this conversation. And I'm hoping that we could start with the two first ones, building power from within in a worker-led organizing movement and using community resources. Baravi, this is something that you have been doing with the taxi workers for a very long time, and that was on kind of full display last fall when there was a huge community mobilization around the hunger strike in front of City Hall, but also I think probably behind the scenes in ways that we didn't even see, worker-led organizing movement for many years that led to that point and made the NYTWA strong enough to pull off that kind of victory. Could you speak to those two things and how you see them in your work?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon and good morning to some of you. It's really great to be here. Our organizing had really taken, just gone to a higher level through COVID, actually. We had been, of course, organizing on this campaign already, but then during COVID, our WhatsApp groups really in the beginning became like self-help groups and people sharing information about where to get food and groceries and medicine, how to know if you have COVID and, how to help people check for missing persons, given that over 90% of drivers are immigrants. And we had a lot of members who are in this country alone and their family members from overseas were really desperate to reach them. And so you saw in the WhatsApp groups, like just the development of the sense of community and that just really, building momentum and growing. The WhatsApp groups also became a real memorial as we lost a lot of drivers. I mean, drivers were among the first New Yorkers to die from COVID, and it changed the discussion, right? Like literally, it became discussions about life and living. And mind you, this is a workforce. Now, the owner drivers who are at the heart of our organizing for the debt forgiveness fight actually are only about 2% of the total workforce. And so they're the smallest percentage of drivers, but they have been the most on the edge of poverty and lifelong poverty because of this massive debt, which on average is like $550,000 for drivers. So in 2017 and 2018, over a 12-month period, we had 9 of our brothers who took their life by suicide, from the economic despair, just the race to the bottom that had left like 96% of Uber and Lyft drivers earning below minimum wage, and had just left thousands of yellow cab medallion owner drivers, in this in the prison of debt. And so kind of, the issues literally of life and death, of grief, we really tackled them as a union family. As Jennifer was saying, I mean, it really, there's such an impulse from capital to try to whittle down worker movements to just dollars and cents, when in reality, it's about, it's about dignity. It's about really humanity and what it means to live in an economic system that robs you of that, right? And so we saw that sense of community building, and then we started to mobilize as soon as the streets started to open back up. And because we're in cars, we could do motorcades, and so we're shutting down bridges. We were shutting down, we're like middle of like Fifth Avenue, Sixth Avenue. People are standing on top of their cars, and just really reclaiming the visibility that, particularly for yellow cab drivers, had really, been stolen from them. I mean, they're operating, the cultural icon of New York City, but the drivers themselves had been so hidden. And with, Uber and Lyft coming into the market completely unregulated and setting off this very, tragic race to the bottom, the people had really begun to forget about the drivers that up before Uber and Lyft came into town had been serving like 1 million people every single day. And so it's like, there is the collective strength that came from the, the friendships that deepened, the sense of community that deepened, people were able to not only help each other survive, but really, I think, reclaim the fighting spirit. That was really the most important thing. And, if you ask me about Taxi Workers Alliance, how do we sum up who we are? We're a fighting union. And, I have to say that is, to me, that link among all the organizing that you're seeing right now. There's a sense of militancy, whether it's people, whether it's shutting down bridges, or it's going in to vote for an election, right? And casting that vote for the union. These are actually acts of militancy in an economic system that is so deeply anti-worker, and anti-union. And, I think that much of this, and I really took to heart what Chris Smalls, the incredible president of the Amazon labor union, said in his testimony before Congress. He said, this is not an ideological thing. This is a working class issue. And I know one can argue, it's not a political thing. It's a working class issue, and which actually is ideological, but yes, it's not political. And I would really say that the common thread here is there's an uprising against neoliberalism. That's what the working class is sick and tired of. People are sick and tired of the war economy. They're sick and tired of, of capitalism, which breeds poverty, which breeds a division, right? Sets people off on a race to the bottom, and has just an obscene level of economic inequality. And meanwhile, all of this is really framed around a military industrial complex where it's a lot of poor kids that are sent to war. And we can talk about kind of the technological developments of US military, but it's still a lot of poor kids getting killed, getting injured, and losing much of their futures. And so I think that what you're seeing is, the independent, it's that uprising, that level of consciousness, across the working class that I do think defies political lines. I actually think you saw that in the elections. But I also think you're seeing, a sense of militancy and community, where the working class is saying that people are not afraid to fight back. I think part of it, going through a global pandemic where there was so much discussion about life and death, well, guess what? A lot of the workers that you're seeing in the uprisings today didn't have that luxury because they had to go out and work. And I think it changed a sense of consciousness to have, to having been able to survive that, and knowing that what allowed many people to get through that was literally the solidarity of their coworkers. And that is now what you're seeing in the streets and in the votes. And I think you're going to continue to see that in more militant worker organizing.
Absolutely. And I think it's striking that, you brought this back as well to the pandemic in particular, and to a moment of crisis, not just around working conditions, but in particular around health. And Jennifer, I know you've written quite a lot about the links between labor and healthcare as well, and mentioned that in your comments. So I want to come back to that in just a moment. Before that, though, Baravi, you mentioned the kind of uptick in militancy as a defining element in this. And the two examples you gave, blocking the streets and casting a vote in an election, are two forms of engagement with the law that are quite different, right? One of them often being illegal, the other being the kind of legal channel for labor organizing that we've had established since the Wagner Act was passed in 1935. So Kate, as a former organizer, but now a legal scholar, can you give us a sketch of how this new organizing relates to and is coming up against the boundaries of the law, and how that is shaping discussions about labor law now and going forward?
Yes, great. Thank you first for organizing this really interesting conversation. I agree with everything that Baravi and Jennifer were saying about the importance, the resurgence really being founded in worker militancy and worker organizing. And no change in law is going to drive any mass movement, or the change really has to come from workers themselves, but it's occurring against a background of law, right? And the state does take a position on what is permitted and what isn't, and weighs in certain ways. And I think it's really important to underscore the extent to which labor law is fundamentally broken and has historically not, at least since the late 1940s, really not effectively protected workers' right to organize and right to strike, even though formally it claims to protect those rights. And there's numerous really deep flaws with our labor law, ranging from the exclusion of whole sectors of the economy, particularly sectors dominated by people of color, like domestic work and agricultural work, but also the growing sector of independent contractors that Baravi referred to. So those workers are not offered any protection under the NLRA. But even for the workers who are covered, labor law has been deeply dysfunctional. So as I said, it promises to protect the right to organize and strike, but in fact has been interpreted to allow just a wide range of employer activity that coerces workers in the exercise of those rights. So for example, employers are not permitted to threaten workers during the course of an organizing campaign. That's technically illegal, but they can hold countless mandatory anti-union meetings where they share facts and opinions and examples that effectively amount to threats, or at least are perceived that way by workers. Another example is, although the statute protects the right to strike, it's been interpreted to allow employers to permanently replace workers who go on strike. So it's not really a right in that context. And then even to the extent the law does prohibit employer coercion and retaliation, because it does, historically there's been very limited enforcement and very few penalties when employers violate the law. So they, sort of as rational economic actors, they do that. They violate the law repeatedly and routinely. And so I think, to fix the sort of deep problems with our law would require statutory reform. But what's really exciting is that this upsurge of organizing activity right now is occurring against a background where you have the NLRB, the agency that's in charge of enforcing labor law, taking a new, really the most effective enforcement and interpretive position it's taken in decades. So we have the board working now to try to actually generate change in the law and to reinvigorate the law so that it actually does what it promises to do and protect the right of workers to organize and to strike and to engage in democracy at work, which is what the statute aims was originally intended to achieve. So just some quick examples of what the agency is up to that I think are particularly exciting. One is that rather than waiting for years for a case to wind its way through the agency and through the courts, if a worker's fired, it can take years for the worker to get their job back. This board has been seeking injunctions, temporary injunctions, so that workers get reinstated when they're fired illegally immediately while the litigation continues. Another really important thing this general counsel is seeking is to have the board reconsider its rule on captive audience meetings. So I mentioned that under the law, as it's been interpreted, employers can force workers to listen to anti-union propaganda as a condition of employment over and over and over again. This general counsel is now arguing that those mandatory meetings are inherently coercive and should be understood to be illegal under the law. She's also asking the board to reconsider its rule on when employers can insist on an election. Under the current interpretation of the law, employers can insist on holding an election, even if they have absolutely no doubt that the majority of their workers want a union. Even if it's completely clear the vast majority of their workers have formed an organization and want to be in a union, employers can insist on an election. This general counsel is seeking a return to the former rule, which required the employer to have good faith doubt, or at least that an employer that when employers violate the law repeatedly, when they engage in unfair labor practices, they can no longer insist on an election just as a way to delay. So, although the upsurge in organizing is what's fundamentally important, the democratic action of workers and the kind of renewed militancy. Because it is occurring at a time where you have a board that is trying to breathe new life into the law and to actually make it do what it's supposed to do and protect workers' rights, I think it makes this a moment of particular possibility and hope, in my view.
I have a question on that, but I think Jennifer, you had a response. Go for it.
Well, in relation to what Kate was just saying, and I think picking up on the story that we heard before about the taxi workers, it really is at moments when workers decide to use very creative tactics of both organizing and resistance that they can begin to push against those barriers of law and policy that try to define them either outside the workforce entirely or that deny their status as workers and employees. So that's precisely what home care workers were able to do, is to start to use tactics of organizing in their housing complexes where they lived, at bus stops, at places. If the law was going to say you don't have a real workplace, then they found all the other ways to organize, especially as a dispersed workforce. And the other thing is to do creative kinds of work stoppages. If law protects property as property and that gives the advantage to management, think of what it means when they simply sit down, workers sit down in the plant. That was an astonishing moment because they actually took over capitalism's property in 1936-37. And also, as Bhairavi was saying, to challenge that visibility boundary. All these workers who were pushed to the margins and those workers were rendered invisible by putting themselves into the public realm, by making their labor visible, by making their presence visible, they do a couple of things. They make it clear that the labor they do is work. They make it clear that they are workers, and they also make it clear that they are political agents who are taking action. And that is what is also successful about, for example, public sector unionism, service sector unionism, even going back to industrial unionism. And I think the kinds of movements by Ravi talks about is those very workers who have been denied any status under the law, they become politicized, and they show up at public hearings, and they march on the Capitol, they march on the State House, they take political action, and they realize, we fight for economic democracy and political democracy together, because concentrated capitalist power has been able to turn their economic power into political power. And so those deficits in, economic and political democracy can be fought by those workers.
So thank you, Jennifer. We're going to move to audience questions in just a moment. I just wanted to transition us in by asking one final question to Baravi, because we've heard both Jennifer and Kate speak about the importance of, the kind of fundamental driver of any changes in law that might happen, or of a redefinition of what constitutes work, or a rise in militancy, comes from a kind of worker-led movement. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about worker-led organizing that, without getting into kind of internecine debates in the labor movement, but has posed a question about what kind of organizing unions should be doing, what good organizing that is successful and genuinely worker-led looks like. And Baravi, I was just hoping that you could reflect on that and, give us a kind of clear articulation as you see it of what worker organizing really looks like.
Sure. Well, I'm going to give you a very, very narrow take on it from our perspective, from our experience. Uber a few years ago started its own company union. And so they partnered with a very big union, the Machinists International Union, with one of their locals in New York City, where they entered into a private contract. No one's ever seen it. And Uber and the Machinists formed an organization that was being financed by Uber. And we found out during the pandemic that Lyft was also giving them money. And they would basically be used to carry the water for the companies, and, just muddy issues. Like we had a big issue of wage theft at one point, where Uber and Lyft had really, stolen drivers' incomes. It's a complicated issue, but they were taking from drivers, money that was supposed to be paid for by the consumer. So, and this company the company union basically go around and say that no, what Uber is doing is totally legit. There's a ton of different examples of it, but they really thought that would work, right? And because they misclassified the drivers as independent contractors, there's a limited chance, the company union would be considered a yellow dog union under the NLRA, but because they misclassified the drivers as independent contractors, they were able to kind of, get away with it for as long as they have. And so, I think, and I bring this up as a serious example, because what we actually don't talk about enough is the extent to which companies interfere with organizing, not only to interfere in order to defeat unionization drives and elections, but also in at least certainly in our case, interfere by creating an actual company union, a yellow dog union. And you know, the whole like finance tech economy, you know, the so-called gig economy. I mean, Uber and Lyft spent more on lobbyists in 2017 than Microsoft, Amazon, you know, Walmart combined, right? There are new experiments in capital to really undermine worker organizing in the most basic level, where it's not even workers that have a voice independent of the company itself. And you know, it's something I think we actually don't talk about enough. I mean, think more generally speaking, when we talk about worker organizing at the moment, a lot of it is about organizations like ours or ALU, or you know, domestic workers, delivery workers, you know, folks that are organizing outside of the traditional labor movement and are not directly affiliated with an existing, you know, labor union. And so financially, you know, you're coming up with your own set of resources. For people like us, we don't have dues check off. Everything is voluntary. I mean, it's very much in the tradition of old school labor movement, you know, whether you're talking about like the steel workers or the farm workers, right? But you see a resurgence of that today. And what I think is really fascinating, and what the ALU in particular represent, is most of us who've been in this, you know, quote unquote worker center movement have generally organized workers who are outside of the NLRA. And we've literally been building the union, you know, to be able to go to them and say, look, we built our union. You know, now you can kind of, you know, now you can codify it, right? And not the other way around. But what's so fascinating about ALU is this is a group of workers that are employees that do have rights under the NLRB. And yet they've been able to, you know, win an election and organize themselves, you know, wholly independent without the resources of the traditional labor movement. I think that is just, I think that's groundbreaking. I think it has to force traditional labor to really take a look at what kind of new organizing it is investing in, that it cannot be top down, that there's merit to, you know, bottom up real grassroots organizing, that you don't have to go into an industry, scope it out, and just try to make a deal from the top, even if you don't consider it a sweetheart deal, but it's still a deal nevertheless, to basically get the blessing of the company that they're not going to challenge you. But to still invest in elections, to still invest in building, you know, worker leadership from the base. I think that, you know, this has to be a real moment of reflection for traditional labor with regard specifically to those kinds of strategies that have been used for far too long, particularly over the past 3 decades.
And on that note, I think we have some questions to that effect as well, and that will help us get at some of the things that all 3 of our panelists have touched on. So over to Sophie.
Yeah, I think this is a really helpful transition. There are a lot of great questions in the comment box and in the Q&A. I kind of want to follow up on Bhairavi's discussion of the ALU and also Starbucks kind of going through the traditional election method and following, you know, like NLRA procedures. We had a question in the chat from Michael Rothman about like the current legal status of those contracts. And so I think I'm gonna ask Kate to maybe expand if she can, but also anybody just to talk about, you know, there are these like incredible wins that we've just seen and then followed immediately by employer pushback and particularly legal pushback. And just what the state of that is, if it's still worth it to kind of undergo this legal procedure, if the pros still overcome the cons. Kate, do you have any ideas?
Well, I guess maybe just to start with the specific question that was in the Q&A, which was, can Starbucks get a contract despite the various legal challenges that it's bringing, as well as the challenges that the NLRB is bringing to its conduct? The law isn't terribly helpful on winning first contracts. The employers are obligated to bargain in good faith, but they're not obligated to actually reach a fair contract, and bargain in good faith. The remedies historically have been pretty minimal when employers refuse to bargain in good faith, usually in order to go bargain in good faith. That said, so I do think that the Starbucks workers and the Amazon workers can win a contract despite the legal challenges, but their ability to do so will depend really on the workers' continued organizing and putting collective pressure and the community and political pressure on the companies to bargain in good faith, combined with what I hope we'll see from the board, which is in addition to the innovations that I already described, I think we're likely to see the board return to some of the limitations that had historically been understood to exist on bargaining remedies. And again, where the law allows, take a more aggressive stance in pushing employers and requiring employers to actually meet their obligation of bargain in good faith. But I do think that ultimately the ability to reach fair contracts, good contracts, and really to transform what are terrible, just outrageously terrible working conditions that lack dignity with low wages and poor benefits into what the workers want from their jobs, that's really going to require collective organizing, militancy, and pressure, hopefully backed up by more effective legal tools as well.
Maybe following up on that to everybody. So something you mentioned is this continued organizing. Oh, Jennifer, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I think also, to again, kind of come back to historical perspective, if you look at, the unionizing efforts of pre-World War II moments, it was again to have a broad set of goals to, provide economic security, but also to democratize the workplace, to enlarge workers' controls, not only over the workplace, but also over institutions in their communities that could provide healthcare, social security, housing, cultural projects. And one of the costs of the narrowing of collective bargaining legally after World War II, and as a result of Taft-Hartley, is it's not only the scope of collective bargaining became so narrowed in terms of the subjects that it could deal with, but also privatized and kind of removed from public, real public visibility and connection to a range of political issues. And so it's only really like when workers can, again, push things back out into a big public civic discussion and a big public political discussion, that they can also get back to the real questions about power. And one of the, I think, fascinating things that we see is happening here, which, again, has happened in other areas, is, the workers' ability to kind of, look at ideological and political culture obfuscations and start to really puncture them or, just demystify them. So, for example, in the 1980s, I think because people had just lived through the economic recession of the 70s, the devastating unemployment, the stagnation of, American company profits, the energy crisis, employers could get away with saying, unions, need to back off from their demands. They have to accept concessions. We're going to start to undermine greedy unions that are asking for too much. And that was kind of an acceptable political rhetoric. But what we see now is these corporations are raking in billions of dollars, right? It's clear that they have billions. They can go to space instead of paying for, say, a national health insurance plan. But, and so it's very clear to workers at Starbucks, at Amazon, at Walmart, that there is an enormous amount of money to be distributed more equitably. Secondly, it's very clear that this whole idea of productivity makes your wages and income go up is a fantasy, and it's false, because their productivity has been ratcheted way up. And the technology has mostly been used not only to ratchet up the level of work they do, but to ratchet up the unsafety of it and the danger of it. And so they can puncture that, I think, and really challenge that kind of Taylorism as has happened in days before. And third, they could puncture that ideological and cultural language of the corporation will take care of you. The we are a family language, you're our associates, you are our partners, that was used in the 1890s, the 1920s, the post-war period. I think it's become really clear to workers that the corporation has no intention of doing that. So to me, these three critical areas have been, demystified, and that's what also opens up the space for this kind of political organizing and protest.
I think on that note, on this political note, I'm gonna do kind of a grab bag of similarly themed questions about the electoral process and how that impacts how unions should be thinking about that. So from Phyllis Bennis, are there any current legislative initiatives that would make a big positive impact on organized labor? From Mark Ginsburg, in what ways have successful union organizing efforts also included or should include actions focused on local, state, and national electoral processes? And I think we also just got one in the chat about any changes underway in the NLRB.
I'd like to jump in and say, the PRO Act, we need the PRO Act would be, federal bill that would make it a lot easier for workers to organize and have, worker organizing be protected. But particularly from our perspective, it would also require at the NLRB something called the ABC test, which is basically what's called the economic realities test. That as the board would answer the question on whether or not this group of workers are employees and therefore have a right to unionize under the NLRB, there would be the test would have the board really look at economic factors of control, but also whether or not the workers are really brand ambassadors, right? Even if there's a level of flexibility in their scheduling, for example, but who in the economic relationship, who really defines it? And if it's a company that defines it, then the workers would be found to be employees and protected under the NLRA. This is the big issue in the so-called gig economy. This, Uber, Lyft, Handy, DoorDash, all these companies are banking on the PRO Act failing and therefore depriving millions of workers across this country the right to unionize. So we need the PRO Act at the federal level, especially given these companies are spending so much money at the state level to pass laws that would take away the rights of workers to be classified as employees at the state level. Right. So on one hand, they don't have the floor of basic labor law from minimum wage, overtime, to, they also wouldn't have the right to unionize, which is what allows you to lift up the ceiling, by continuing to misclassify them also for the purposes of the NLRA. So that I know in New York, we're part of a coalition that's calling for an ABC test at the state level. And in New York, we do have a state bargaining rights framework. So meaning that for workers that have been not found to be employees for NLRA purposes, the state could legislate bargaining rights at this level. But lots of states do not have that. California does not have that, for example. So the hundreds of thousands of workers that were after $250 million ballot initiative from Uber and Lyft were deprived of basic labor protections under California state law. They also don't have a framework for, bargaining rights. And at the state level, they would need it at the federal level. So I want to say that as much as you have, a few Republicans at the moment that are really holding up the PRO Act, I think that, again, going back to what President Smalls had said, I absolutely believe that it cuts across, that the belief in collective bargaining and unionization cuts across political lines in our country. And, with I think a broader working class movement that is more class conscious and less politically driven, we can, this is something that the labor movement can organize to win. And it's the most fundamental issue for the survival of the labor movement. We need to see the PRO Act passed.
Can I just jump in? We have only a couple minutes left, and I'd like to kind of continue on this theme because a lot of the questions that we've been getting have to do with, what rising labor militancy needs from the law, but also what they can push for in the law. And I mean, just to push it a little bit, Kate, this will come to you. The PRO Act is, would be an absolutely incredible thing. I think we all agree. It's also a ways out from being feasible in Congress as it stands now. Maybe can we bring this back also to kind of what it would take for legislative and legal reform to be open and feasible in a way that would be really meaningful for labor and for workers. How close are we to that? And what do we need in order to get there?
I'll start really quickly. There are so many amazing questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to get to. So just a couple of quick thoughts. I mean, for one, I think just to highlight the PRO Act, in addition to what Paravi was saying about expanding who counts, who's an employee, it would also create much stronger and swifter remedies and penalties. It would make it a lot easier for workers to organize unions. It would make it easier to get first contracts. It would protect the right to strike. It would override state right to work laws. It's extremely important. I also think it doesn't go far enough, but that's a conversation for another day. But as Daniel said, it's not something that anyone thinks is going to pass right away. In the meantime, the agency, which is a multi-member agency that is currently, the majority of the board members are Democrats, and there's a very creative general counsel, Jennifer Abruzzo, who comes out of the labor movement, is actually pushing a lot of the ideas of the PRO Act at the administrative level, and that is really important. Of course, it can be immediately changed if the Republicans are in charge of the agency again, or if a more conservative administration is in charge. But there's also really important work occurring at the state and local level, and there's quite an even though NLRA preemption is very broad, there is the ability to enact state and local legislation that protects workers' rights in ways that not preempted by federal law. So state and local legislation is very important too. And then, as a number of the comments in the chat suggest, it's critical that labor issues become and their relationship to the future of the democracy are really front and center at debates, and so that there's new people elected right at both the state, local, and federal level who are committed to these issues, so that the PRO Act and other even more substantial labor reforms can become a reality. So I think, continued organizing, continued work at the agency and in Congress, but then also local and state legislative reform is important. And I also saw Nelson Lichtenstein had a question about convincing elites. I think there's been some change, at least among Democratic elites in recent years, but we're still a long way off, I think, from that goal as well.
So yeah, I would say, we should keep in mind that there was no passage of the NLRA in 1935 until there had been a mass strike wave in 1934. And there was no, state level California Labor Relations Act or, a New York, for agricultural workers, or a New York collective bargaining act for public sector workers until there had been a decade of strikes and mass action on the ground. So, it's going to take the mass action to push any kind of political change at higher levels. However, I also think what we can do is let's remember what has made the right so successful. It's not only that they built institutions, they built a movement, but they also were clear about the fact that this was a war for ideas. And so the other thing, we can do is not only, be in solidarity and be there on the ground with people who are fighting this fight, but we also have to change the narratives that are out there about the inevitability of austerity, about the inevitability of privatization, about the notion that corporate wealth is justified and should not be distributed, about the only way we're going to be prepared for climate change and all of the future challenges is through progressive taxation. And so we can rewrite the ideas and we can change the narrative to be one that is going to reach out to a broader public. So I think in addition to our political engagement and engagement on the ground, that's also where the fight lays.
I think that's a wonderful and fitting place to end. I'm sorry that we have to cut so many good questions short. Thank you to our audience members for a really amazing chat all the way through. Some wonderful questions that I hope we'll be able to continue to answer as we go, and some that I hope will resolve as the movement and this kind of moment of labor militancy continues to grow. So thank you so much for all of the panelists. Thank you to the nation and to Dawn for hosting us. And we will hope to see you at another Nation event soon, or even better, in the streets.